Let's talk Bendy and the ink machine. First, a brief summary of the game so far. In Chapter 1, the player, known as Henry, gets a letter from his old boss and friend Joey Drew that requests he comes back to the old studio so Joey can show him something. They've been apart for 30 years, which means that Henry has to be at least 50-60 years old. He obliges and arrives on the scene where it seems the studio's been abandoned and largely unmolested for all that time. Exploring the workshop a bit, he notes many things about it remain unchanged. His old animator's drafting desk is still right where he left it, for instance. He listens to some recordings of others that were in the company talking about the way the boss is acting, and about the so-called ink machine, which he discovers. With some admittedly tedious walking around the studio and checking every little nook and cranny, he finds the 6 items that Joey had the employees of the studio donate to the power room of the ink machine and restarts it. Returning back to the room with the machine in it, he finds it curiously boarded up, and we see the first physical manifestation of what is likely a creature created by the ink machine, an entity that's covered with ink and has Bendy's head shape, but is tall and lanky. The studio starts to fill up with ink, so Henry decides it's high time to leave the place and buy new shoes, but in trying to leave, he falls through some faulty floorboards and is deposited into the basement of the studio, where an obviously occult ritual of some sort has been staged. When he steps into the circle on the ground, he has a seizure, accompanied by what either appear to be flashbacks or remote viewing, and blacks out. Chapter 2 starts here. Henry wakes up and makes his way forward to try to escape the basement, which is apparently bigger than he remembers it being. He slogs through some passages filled with ink, finds some buttons that are never in the same place twice, thanks tedium disguised as replay value, that open a door into the music recording studio, and is suddenly accosted by creatures with no complete physicality that are made of puddles of ink. In this place, he listens to a bunch of recordings again and finds out where he's supposed to go to get a better shot at leaving. He traipses around looking for a set of keys that's never in the same wastebasket, because of course, and uses some musical instruments to open a door into a deeper part of the recording studio. He eventually gets attacked by someone covered head to toe in a latex-looking inky black substance, and is tied up to be used as a sacrifice to Bendy, in exchange for Bendy freeing the masked person from
this inky, dark abyss I call a body.
It turns out that Bendy doesn't come for you right away, and instead goes after the masked man, allowing you time to get free of your bonds, and then run away from the monster down ink-filled hallways. When he finally gets to a safe place, and barricades the door behind him, he encounters another ink-based entity, one that doesn't seem intent on killing him immediately. That's what we have so far in the first 2 chapters. The story raises a lot of questions, so let's talk about several of them in a series of videos. This time we'll focus on the things we encounter in the game, and what the ink machine really even does. Firstly, let's talk about the ink itself. There's a lot of ink in this place, and it gets even more mired in the liquid after you turn the machine on. Well, where does the ink come from? Well, first thoughts might be that the machine generates ink endlessly. However, if that's the case, then shouldn't the ink pressure not matter when the machine is turned on? I mean, if it generates it by itself, it should generate its own pressure. However, we have to go down and push the pressure button in order to turn the machine on first. This implies that there's a store of ink somewhere that has to be pressurized into the machine itself before it will run. We know from the audio logs we hear that the whole studio has ink pipes that run through the walls and ceiling that often break. This implies that somewhere in the studio there's just a vast, huge tank full of ink. There's enough ink in the hallways and rooms that if we're to assume that that's only a portion of the ink that's in the system, there'd have to be an Olympic-sized swimming pool of ink somewhere. The amount of space it would need is enormous. But given that Henry comments that the place has gotten much bigger than he seems to remember when he's in the basement, maybe part of the weird magical ritual that we see took place downstairs has widened the place up, enough to store the ink somewhere? Or maybe, and this is just speculation, but... okay, hear me out. We see the ink-covered mask guy walk into a dead end and disappear. However, later on when we meet him, he exhibits no outside traits of a supernatural nature, minus the whole being covered with the ink stuff. To me, that looks like there's some kind of extra-dimensional thing going on, a way to cross borders between our world and the world where maybe Bendy and Boris live. It stands to reason that such a world, which is created by ink on paper, would be made of ink. Could that be the source of the infinite ink? It stands to reason in the same way that if someone from the ink world, which is two-dimensional, came here, they would of course have to transition to being the correct amount of dimensions in this world. However, going from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions might be much more traumatic. When the man in the mask, who is Sammy Lawrence, stumbles into such a place, that's when his body is covered in the otherworldly ink, and when, thanks to being forced into having only 2 dimensions instead of 3, he's driven immediately mad. I mean, try to conceive of a reality where you only exist on 2 dimensions. It's cosmically horrible to think about, literally inconceivable. We cannot think it. To be thrust into a world that exists in a different number of dimensions is probably the quickest way to be driven to complete madness. So how did that happen? How did the veil between ink and earth get breached? Well, we see down in the ritual rooms that in front of the occult symbology on the ground there are 2 coffins. Later, there are 2 more coffins near a darker, messier version of the circle. It looks like when Joey Drew was performing his occult rituals, he needed bodies. Humans to complete the magic. Sacrifices. 4 coffins. So who do we know existed in the studio? Well, there's Joey, who does the ritual. There's you, who's alive and playing the game. Then there are the 4 other employees. Norman Polk, Wally Franks, Susie Campbell, and Sammy Lawrence. That would mean the correct number of sacrifices for the boxes we see, but then if they were sacrificed, that would mean one of 2 things. Either the sacrifices are not just killings, but were attempts to change them into the kind of ink-mad creature that Sammy is. Sammy seems to be alive and indeed the only human, or at least once human, that we see, which would imply that at least one of the sacrifices took effect. If that's the case, what happened to the other 3? Or the 4 coffins we see don't have those named characters in them. Follow me on this. In one of the audio logs, Wally Franks talks about how Joey asked each of us to donate something from their workstations to appease the gods. Well, there are 6 workstations, each representing a different department in the studio. So there's a pot of ink from animation, a record from music, a plushie from merchandising, a wrench from janitorial and maintenance, a gear from engineering, and a book from what I can assume is the executive staff. So we know that Joey must have donated the book, Wally donated the wrench, Sammy donated the record, and Norman the gear, since he runs the projector in the recording studio, and that's the only thing that can really be paralleled as part of engineering there. But then who donated the plushie, and who donated the ink pot? Maybe you could have donated the ink pot? No, that doesn't work because the timeline doesn't work! We'll talk about that one in another video. I'm still kind of salty about that. But that leaves at least one more unidentified staff member in the studio. I'm not even sure I buy the gear being part of Norman's workstation. If anything, Norman would have probably donated something like a conductor's wand. So, the people in the coffins are possibly named characters we know, and possibly also characters we haven't met yet. Maybe just unnamed mooks from the studio. I'm making the assumption that Sammy wasn't sacrificed or killed, so he probably wasn't one of the necessary sacrifices. So who's in the caskets? Anyway, whoever's in there, Joey does something that gives him the ability to ostensibly use the ink machine to create his characters. However, if we're going by the dimensional rip theory, then what I posit is that Joey Drew actually created the entire Bendy universe, that he willed it into being using the ink machine, and then afterwards used the occult rituals to cross the borders between them. I'd even posit that the machine itself is a mixture between magic and technology, and that Joey had to use different other magic to find a way to go to the world he created. Once he got the border broken, he dragged the character Boris back through the portal and messed with his body to see what made him tick. Boris, lacking the life-giving ink from his dimension that could rebuild his body, remained dead on that operating table, with only just enough trickles of ink to keep him from decaying. He remained dead after vivisection, until the ink machine was turned back on. Once the machine got turned back on, you could see spurts of ink spraying out from his open chest cavity. When we see him later, he's not only fully regenerated, but his overalls are perfect, and he's completely un-ink splattered. He regenerated once the machine got turned on. This means that the machine is the thing that powers the universe from which the cartoon characters come. So while the machine is turned off, the ink doesn't flow. That means that the only ink from that world that exists in our world is in the pipes and puddles in the studio. With as little ink as that, Bendy could only manifest as the moving Bendy cardboard cutouts. The first time we see a living, moving character from that universe is the second the ink machine gets turned on, and it's a drippy, screwed-up version of that character. Well, this is as much as I can think of to fit in one decently sized video, so we'll talk about more things like how I hate the timeline, and how the gameplay is tedious and uninspired but the story is super cool, in another video. Look forward to a couple more videos exploring theories in this world. I want to talk about the weird cult-like aspects of Sammy as well, so I think that's what we'll talk about in the next video. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed it. If you did, the like and subscribe buttons are waiting just below this video to be the things that turn the ink machine on so that your cartoon body can regenerate using the life-giving ink from your own generation. You can also follow my socials, that's the Facebook and Twitter that are in the description box, and if you feel like it, you can throw some support my direction at the Patreon link that's down there as well. Help me keep making videos like this one. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.